Hello? Okay, well, we're going to get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our last Gen AI tutorial for the fall semester. We really appreciate everyone coming out in the snow and the slush. I'm really glad people are here. It's going to be an exciting session. So to start off, this session is called Intro to Open AI Models. And it's led by Dr. Elle O'Brien, faculty at the School of Information. But before I hand the mic off to Elle, I'm going to just give a plug and shout out to our Gen AI tutorials for next semester. We have 3 planned, and they are centered around tutorials for data visualization, deep research and literature review, and agentic AI. So our faculty postdocs are really excited to teach you these hands-on tutorials. So visit our website, scan the QR code for more information. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it off to Elle.
All right, thanks. I'm going to switch to. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's great to be here with you all. Just a little heads up, I'm getting over a sore throat, so if I'm talking too quiet and you can't hear me, just say, hey, we can't hear you, and I'll try to talk louder. But hopefully I am sufficiently mic'd. So a little bit about me. My background, my PhD is from University of Washington, and I studied auditory neuroscience using computational methods. And right around the time that I was graduating, I graduated in 2019, we were starting to see, some big shifts in what models look like. So I came from models were usually pretty mechanistic. Like we would have measurements from animals, and we would have, laws from physics about how do systems behave, right? What happens if you have a tissue with these properties and you have an electrode with these properties? What happens to the neural signal? And these were based on a lot of careful measures and theoretical understanding. And there was also this paradigm that was growing in machine learning, which is about these data-driven models, which are fairly agnostic to how anything works, but you just throw a lot of data at a problem and you see what patterns and representations can be learned. And so that really blossomed in the years recently that we've seen. And I don't think anybody is untouched or unaware of that now, thanks to the mainstream popularity of things like ChatGPT. After I graduated, I worked as an open source advocate at a startup that made data version control. I don't know if anybody's ever used that tool, but it's basically get version control adapted to data. So I was there, and I made a lot of, basically I would teach people on the internet about using version control and trying to make version control fun, which is a very challenging task. And now I teach and I research at UMSI, the School of Information. My research is actually about how scientists program using large language models based tools. So how does coding change when people are using some of these tools to, to help them either look up information, to write code, what's changing? So that's just a topic of interest for me. And I'm also the director of Midas's graduate certificate in data science. I took over that in August, and it's been a lot of fun. And we're working on how do we create, the possibility for any graduate student on campus to be taking some classes that help them learn about applications of data science and AI to their research area, whatever that research area may be. So I want to tell a quick story about a study that I worked on that kind of frames why I care about open source models. And ironically, this study is, or maybe sadly, maybe it's not ironic, maybe it's just sad. This isn't really possible to do anymore because if you can't really study Twitter the same way as when I started this study. So this study was about wellness influencers on the internet, so people who post helpful wellness tips on the internet, and looking at, during the pandemic, what kind of attitudes did they take towards the public health campaign to get people vaccinated and towards the vaccine. And this was inspired by, I had read a bunch of work by some sociologists that studied wellness influencers. And they were saying that, for a lot of influencers, a core part of their identity and their appeal is that they have to appeal as a bit of, anti-establishment. You have to set yourself apart from a mainstream establishment in order to have an angle that you're speaking from, some authority. And so I wanted to see if, make some predictions based on that theory and see if they held up on social media. So this involved looking at people's tweets about vaccination and labeling the stance of those tweets. So this is a problem. It's a classification problem of sorts where you look at a tweet, and these are some real ones. Coronavirus vaccine developed by Oxford University appears safe and trains the immune system. Another one, will it alter DNA and remote control people through 5G? Yes. Why is there even a vaccine for an illness with such a high survival rate? So you will have real tweets, and you're trying to figure out from the given tweet, can you infer something about the authors, or at least in that tweet what is expressed? What is the stance towards the vaccine? Now, you can label these by hand, but Twitter data is huge, right? And we want to track a lot of accounts over a long period of time. So we found that there was another team, this is at the University of Sheffield, that had adapted a large language model to the task. And I'll break down what that means a bit. So basically, they used a machine learning model, and they adapted it so that it could do this task. You take a tweet like this, and then there are these categories. And this was their idea, right? They didn't just say pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine. Looking at the data, they realized that there's actually more categories than that. Something could be pro-vaccine, and it could be anti-vaccine, but a lot of tweets are just hesitant. They're questioning, and it doesn't necessarily invoke a stance. It just says, hey, I have a question about this. I'm not so sure. And a lot of tweets are also irrelevant. Something could be on the topic of the pandemic. It could even have a keyword and not really express a stance at all, and it's kind of irrelevant. So that's something that you only get by really looking at the data. But they had that insight, and they trained a model to do this. So in this case, they labeled this as, for example, this would be a hesitant tweet. Now, where did their model come from? I was trying to make like a simple slide about this, and then the longer I looked at it, I realized I really just have to tell you the whole story of it. There's a lot of reuse, and it's medium complicated. So what they created was a model that they called VaxBERT, and you're going to see BERT comes up a lot. We'll talk about why, but the BERT, you're going to get really used to seeing BERT. So they trained a model called VaxBERT. And then they adapted that model to do the classification on stances. But where does VaxBERT come from? VaxBERT is a fine tune, is what it's called, of something called COVID Twitter BERT, which came from a research group in Switzerland. And that is a fine tune of a model called BERT Large, which came from Google. Google is BERT. So there's actually several steps here of who made this? This model here is trained on Wikipedia and an open book corpus, and it's trained not for a particular task. I mean, it is trained on a particular, every model that is trained has an objective that it is trying to do its best on, but it's sort of for a general purpose, what can we learn about the representation of text data, and then it can be adapted to a lot of kinds of tasks. This is then specialized on tweets that are on the topic of COVID that contain COVID-related keywords. This one is about just vaccines, so it's an even smaller, more specialized version. And then they have to specialize it further to the exact task. So there's a lot of reuse. We are building on a lot of people's work, right? And then here's me. I get to come in and I get to say, thank you, everybody else. I'm just going to take this off the shelf and see if it, and then reuse it. So basically, all of these people saved me a tremendous amount of work, because if they all did this groundwork to create something that would do a much better job on this classification task than I would do if I were trying to create a model from scratch. And because if they had done the work of making it open and reporting it, so also reporting, important information about what it is trained on and how it's evaluated, it has the rigor that it's not like somebody just emailed me something and said, hey, just use this to classify things, it's good enough. Someone who wanted to understand, is this justified? In what ways might this model have flaws? Or, how was it evaluated? They could actually trace that back. So that's kind of an example of something that I think exists in the foundation model paradigm. You might have heard the phrase foundation model. In machine learning and AI, a lot of terms are used. there's a lot of drift, right? So words get used in different communities, and there's often not like a really rigorous, like, absolute definition that we're all adhering to. There are multiple definitions of foundation models that are out there. Here's one I like from a recent paper about scientific use of foundation models. A foundation model is a pre-trained model whose initial development requires substantial investment in data, compute, and expertise, but which can be efficiently adapted and reused across a wide range of downstream tasks. Its value lies not just in its architectural design, but in the broad utility enabled by the upfront training effort. And I just want to peek into this a little bit, but like I mentioned, so BERT and all of the other BERTs that come after it, I think BERT stands for Bidirectional Encoder Representation Transformer? I'm not positive. That's not exactly it, I think. Did I get it right? Yeah. Oh, thank you. But for these models, they're not trained in particular with the expectation that they will be used for one particular kind of task. Like, you could use them for a classification task, but you can also use them with a little bit of adaptation for things like take some text and extract just what are the most important keywords in it. You could say, help me, fill in the blank in a text. It's kind of got a wide variety of uses. It's like a bit of a Swiss Army knife, and they're explicitly developed to be useful on a wide variety of tasks instead of being narrowly scoped for a particular task. And so because of it learns a generally useful representation of text information, it then takes very little work to put on that last layer that says just classify something, right? It's like it gets you 99% of the way there. So the study that I mentioned here, this is actually a preprint that just came out, and I emailed the authors to let them know how grateful I am that they published this. But they were doing a survey basically through literature. So they took a huge data set of papers that have come out in the last couple of years, and they were looking at where are different models being used, what kind of models are being used and where. And I don't know if this is entirely visible, because I know it's kind of a big table. But we have in different fields of study, they were looking at what are the top 3 foundation models that are in use. So BERT Large, the same model that was being used in this COVID tweet labeling paradigm, is being used quite a lot in linguistics, in law. Do we see it elsewhere? We see it in computer science too. They have this column here, model age in years. So this is when was the model released? And we can see that the models these are not that new, right? So a lot of these are now 3 years old, 5 years old that are being used. And then this thing, open weight. So what is open weight? Has anybody heard of this before? Open weight? Okay, well, so when we say open source, right, so generally what people mean by that, I'm not going to give like a super strict definition, but usually the common usage of that phrase is that the code's going to be open to see where something, how it's trained. And then you might also see something like these are the data sets that it's trained on, and then maybe this is like a copy of the model itself. A copy of a model, that's going to be, it might be the form of weights. It might be a binary executable file that is ready to run and do inference. There's a few ways it can look, but generally open source means that we're making the materials involved in the production of this model available. Some models are open weight, but it doesn't mean that they're fully open. So open weight would be like they actually give you the weights for the trained model at the end, but you won't have access to all the data that it was trained on. So for example, OpenAI has made open weights GPT-2, so that model you can get the weights for. That does not mean you know everything that the model is trained on. So we have this there's grades of transparency here. So most of the models that are being used scientifically are open weight. It doesn't mean we know everything about their origin. I will also say that with foundation models, it does not mean that they are replicable. The compute required to make a lot of these is intense. So just because somebody gives you the code, and even if they give you the data, it doesn't mean functionally that you could or would want to replicate it from scratch. there's something else here that I just want to point out, which is that a lot of these models are not really generative AI. So generative AI as a phrase, again, the distinction's a little bit fuzzy, but usually when people think about generative AI, they're thinking of ChatGPT, something that is really designed to, you put in text, you prompt in natural language, and then it gives you text out that kind of simulates, the experience of, having a conversation. And that's by design. They really engineer tools like ChatGPT for that experience. Or you say, I want a picture of this, and then you get out a picture from, DALL-E or whatever your image generating model is. So those really have an emphasis on creating outputs that, that look or sound, whatever it is, in a way that the user expects. Like it tries to make the output as realistic as possible in some dimension. A lot of these models, any model, you can use it generatively. You can use anything to try to produce an output, but that's not really kind of their core functionality. So something like BERT large, you can generate text with BERT, but most of the time BERT is not being used to generate text. It's being used for something like classify or pick out from a paragraph, pick out the keyword, right? It's often defined, narrowly scoped tasks. It's not just like, write me an essay, right? So that's not necessarily happening. A lot of these things too, like the VGG16, that's kind of like an analog of BERT, but for image data. It's not an exact architectural analog, but you can think of it in a similar way of being a foundation model that's broadly useful for a lot of tasks like classifying images, putting a box around an object in an image, detecting or counting how many things are in an image. So none of these are really models that we think of as the forefront of generative AI. So I just want to point that out, that not all foundation models are generative, and maybe a lot of the models that are being used in science are not generative either, but it doesn't mean they're not useful. In fact, I would say that there's probably a more limited set of use cases where we're trying to emphasize the generation. So why not just use the ChatGPT API? So I know I just said, we're not using actually that much generative work in a lot of these fields, but why not just say to, ChatGPT, hey, I'm going to give you, this tweet, and you tell me, just return what's the it's the stance of the tweet, right? And give it a couple categories and say, which one of these is it? You can force ChatGPT to do those kind of things. So there's a few reasons why, scientifically, it's often not the choice we want to make to just rely on somebody else's product and their API. The first is that there is not a guarantee of long-term reproducibility. So whatever is behind OpenAI's API, that's theirs, and they can change it at any time. They can say, as of today, we are no longer serving the model that we were serving before, and then your work may not be replicable after that point. It is not always clear what happens behind someone else's API. So depending on the provider and what they've chosen to document, it's possible that their models, like, maybe there's a prompt on them, like a system prompt that is happening, and you don't know what it is because they only have that on their end, and that influences the kind of responses you get, but you don't know about it. Or maybe they make a decision behind the scenes of which model they're going to pass your prompt to, and you don't know which model it is. So there's kind of, we would just trust people about what's behind their API, but we don't know for sure. Oh, and the API, sorry, if people are not familiar with this, you can interact with ChatGPT through your browser. You can have a chat with it, but the models are also available via something called an API, which is basically the programmatic way to access it. So you could programmatically say like, hey, I'm a real user, I have permission to use this, and you pass it a secret code that indicates that. Please, I'm just going to programmatically send a prompt and send the response back. And so this is how people tend to do this at scale. There's also an important case, I think, for building expertise and independence within scientific organizations. So if all of the knowledge about how do you use models lives entirely outside of us, and we have to rely on companies to do that, that puts us in a really vulnerable position, especially if we have a growing fraction of papers that are using these models in some capacity. So for scientific reproducibility, I'm going to say, and I think it's kind of the consensus about how are people behaving already You should have at least the model weights. You should be using probably at least open weight models. So that means make sure you can get a copy of the weights for the model, have it on your computer, run it. And when I say your computer, it could be any computer you own. It could be on Great Lakes. It could be on a cloud instance. Doesn't really matter, but it should be on your side. You should have those. And then at the very least, you can say, at the time I did this study, this is the model that I used, and you can replicate it at any time in the future. As long as your computer works, you can go back and you can run it again. You can say, hey, I'm going to adjust my outputs a little and see how does that affect, what happens. That's going to be super valuable for, keeping some artifact, kind of versioned and part of your computational workflow. So I'm going to introduce now what's kind of, I think, the dominant open source project for browsing and hosting open models. I don't work for Hugging Face. I don't get anything for this. I'm just a fan. With that said, I'm presenting this as a user who likes it. So the most up-to-date and rigorous and thorough information about them is going to come through their own doc. So I'm going to do my best. But you might have questions about this that I can't answer. So what we have here on their homepage is just a look at, I guess there's this big graphic. They have some trending things. They have something called spaces. They have something called data sets. But what I really want to focus on today is models. So when you click on models here, you're going to get taken to this page where you can browse, essentially. So what we can see here is that there are more than 2 million models. So that's quite a lot. It's not going to be necessarily obvious, like, oh, there's one model that you should use, right? There's a lot of models that take some work to think through which ones are useful for you. And you can do a couple things. You can search. You can sort, so it's often interesting to me to look at, what's the most downloaded model. We can see we have something, I use this a lot, the sentence transformers. This is the organization before the slash, and then after that is the name of the model. This is patterned after GitHub. So on GitHub, you have like an account name, you have your username or your organization, and then after that is the repository name. I think this is just like basically a fork of the GitHub code, I think. So it's, and obviously, updated to be specialized for models, but it's very similar if you're used to that interface. We can see that so Google is contributing. Sentence Transformer is an open source project. OpenAI is contributing. There's quite a lot. And then there's some names that you might be unfamiliar with, and that's because there's lots of small groups that do things. There are some research groups that do things. There's individual contributors. There's a pretty big range of people contributing here. So one thing that's really useful to do is to sort by tasks. So I kind of think one of the ideas that OpenAI will push a lot in their marketing is that you only really need one model, right? Like, oh, now that we have ChatGPT, that can do everything. But in practice, models have there's maybe more models than ever. The complexity and the number of choices is going up because while ChatGPT might do an okay job on a lot of things, oftentimes the best performance still comes from specializing in some way. So doing some adaptation on the foundation model, not just leaving it, as it is out of the box. So a lot of things are still kind of broken up by task. So if we look at something like computer vision, right, we can see we could pick just models that are for image classification. And right here, looks like the top one is not safe for work image detection. I can imagine that is a very important problem for a lot of people on the internet. One other thing I will point out is that a lot of these models and the use cases, a lot of the users are not scientific users. So there is some work in figuring out what's really more for e-commerce and what's for me. A lot of the same techniques are still useful. Like, you can learn from what they did. But a lot of models are designed where there's, financial incentives to build in that direction. So that puts scientists at a little bit, we're definitely not the intended, audience for a lot of this. But a lot of things are still quite useful. Let's see, let's pick another one. We could do on natural language processing, text classification. So we can see some of these. Finbert, I know about this. I have a lot of students who they want to do projects where they are trying to make financial forecasts. And so this is a model that is trained on text that has to do with finance topic discussion. An NLP model to analyze the sentiment of financial text. So you can see that there's just a little look at that. Oh, but actually maybe let me just go back to that and say, what are we looking at here? This is called a model card. So this is Hugging Face kind of leads the way on this. It's sort of like on a GitHub repository, you might have a README that says, what's in this. A model card is a little bit like that, but it contains information that you probably should know if you are trying to figure out if a model is relevant for what you're trying to do. So they have some documentation about it. On the official page, they have like a docs page about reading model cards. And this one's actually pretty short. So maybe this isn't the best example. But let's do this. I want to give people a challenge to try using the site and practice reading a model card. So let's take 5 minutes to do this. You can do this on your computer, or if you want to buddy up with somebody and do it together, that's okay too. But let's just take like 5 minutes and try this challenge. Find the repository for OpenAI's GPT-2 model, and then I have a couple questions for you to try to figure out. How are people doing? Do you want another minute, or are most people wrapped? Okay, do another minute. All right, let's come back. Even if you're not done, that is completely okay. Let's chat together. All right, so to find this model, we could search GPT-2, right? So this where people got to? Good, yay. All right, so what was the first question? What language is the text the model was trained on? English, right? This is probably, if you work on language models, this is like, oh man, you have to know this. Like the first question you get to when you look at a model should be, what language is this trained on? Many are now multiple, but you still got to know. Okay. What is the intended use of the model? Did anyone find a section about this? Yeah, so we go down, intended uses or limitations. You can use the raw model for text generation or fine-tune it to a downstream task. See the model hub to look for fine-tuned versions on a task that interests you. Who wrote the model card?
That's safe tensor or the citation, the name of the citation at the bottom.
So it's actually, they put it right here. So this disclaimer, the team releasing GPT-2 wrote a model card for their model, and then, but this model card here was actually written by the team at Hugging Face. So I think, I'm not positive, but I think the reason that this happened is that Hugging Face wanted to host this model, and then it looks like they just wrote this themselves because at the time, I don't think that OpenAI had made one available along with it, and they really wanted to use the model card format. And then, I mean, we could check the dates. We could check, because we could look at what date OpenAI wrote theirs and check it against the date that it was published on Hugging Face. But it looks like they have a model card and, oh, I'm wrong. It's the other way around. I just didn't read far enough. They took their model card and then it didn't have all of the information that Hugging Face likes to have as standardized, and they added more to it. So to complete the information they provided and give specific examples of bias, which is part of what Hugging Face wants to see on their model cards. Yes?
So on the page, what is the safe tensor thing on the right?
What is the safe tensors?
It's below downwards last one on the right.
Oh, here.
Is that not?
I'm not sure. Let's check this. It looks like this is a maybe this is a badge to show that they're using this format for storing the tensors, but I'm not sure what that means. I think it just means that they support this storage format. Yeah. What is the vocabulary size for this model? What do you think that might mean?
50,000 to 57.
Where do you find that?
Pre-processing at the
Yeah, so in this pre-processing section here, so this is here, they have a section where they talk about the training procedure. So training procedures can be fairly technically complicated. I'm gonna say these are, the further you go into your work with these, it's useful to understand what this means, but to get started, it's not strictly necessary to, deeply understand this. I would just, if you see this and you don't get it all the way, that's okay as you're beginning. But essentially what happens is that they're trying to give some insight here into how the model is trained, what is the process. In this case, I think GPT-2 also has a paper that's associated with it that you can read that goes into really deep details of it. But here they're saying that the texts that are the training data are tokenized using this strategy and has a vocabulary size of 50,257. What is a vocabulary size? So this is, anybody? Any guesses? Yes.
The number of unique tokens.
Yeah, it's the number of unique tokens that the model is trained on. So models don't necessarily represent text in words. They represent text in tokens. Tokens may be words, but often they're not. They're like maybe like a chunk of a word. We can actually see it. I think you can just see the vocabulary. You can see in the vocab JSON, it's going to be too large, but let's see the raw. Yeah, this is just going to be a big list of like what are the tokens and then what's their corresponding kind of index in this list of tokens. So basically the model will break text into these kind of tokens, and that's actually what it trains on, is like kind of a dictionary of tokens. It's not a dictionary, it's a data type. I'm just thinking about, what is the dictionary? We can think of it as a bit of a dictionary. Yeah, so models are not training on language the way that we learn language. They represent it differently. When was the code associated with this model last updated? Maybe we could see this if we go into files and versions. Yeah, we could see these, over 2 years ago. You can look at in the commits, you can look at when's the last date. So you could go in and figure out what was the last date here. How many fine tunes of the model are available? I think the answer is a lot. Let's see. Yeah, so if we go here, we have this model tree. So if we click on this, then we can see all of these are going to be people who took that model and then they fine-tuned it either on more specific data or for a specific task. So you could click around on these and see what people are doing with it. Yeah, like somebody's got a Python code generator, Arabic poetry generator, Turkish reviews, wiki text. Yeah. And is this the biggest version of GPT available on the hub?
GPT XL.
Yeah, there is a GPT XL. You can check out GPT XL. You can go here too. Yes, so oftentimes people that release foundation models will release kind of a family of them. So like BERT, there was BERT large, BERT tiny. Smaller models are going to be generally less parameters, easier to run on your computer. They're going to be less resource intensive to run. They are usually less powerful, not always across, like you can't necessarily say that a model that has, X parameters is going to be less powerful than a model with X plus, 100 parameters, but usually within the same family, the smaller the model, the less powerful. But a lot of applications do not need the absolute, most powerful thing that we have, right? There's often trade-offs of being energy efficient or resource, efficient. Okay, any questions about what we've talked about so far? Or about this page that we're looking at on Hugging Face? Yeah, okay, so if the vocabulary is what we saw in that dictionary file, or the JSON file, what are the parameters? So models they're deep neural networks, and so essentially how I often think about them is linear regression stacked on linear regressions with other weird nonlinear functions in between them. So the architecture of models is really complicated, and you could have we could have a whole semester-long class about that, and it's really complicated. But oftentimes the simplest analog I think of is if you have a linear regression model, what's the equation for a line? Y equals mx plus b, right? If you wanted to store a particular linear regression model, and I know it's a linear regression model, what are the two values that I need to know to basically, you need m and b, right? If I want to save the weights for a linear regression, I save m and b. And as long as I know that's a linear regression, I could perfectly rehydrate that, be like, here's my model. So essentially it's that, but there's billions of them, and it's not y equals mx plus b. If I wrote it out, it would be like thousands and thousands of lines of algebra to approximate it. Yeah. So when we save model weights, to be completely transparent, just the weights themselves are useless. You also need to know what the architecture is, but every repository that uses some strategy for saving the model is also going to include what's the architecture so that it could be, you can put the weights back where they should be in the model. Any other questions here? I know that we're covering this is honestly fairly deep stuff that we are glossing over the surface of, because how do these models work is kind of the elephant in the room that I'm not discussing here, right? We're just kind of going, how do we start to access them? All right, okay. I do have a couple other scavenger hunts, but I want to move on just in the interest of getting time to actually do some code examples. The other thing I would suggest is to go through and look at things like in the model browser, can you sort by text? Can you sort by a task by object detection? What's the most downloaded model for video classification? Just get in there and start looking around. The diversity of models that people are making and playing with is really extraordinary. And just get in there and have a look. And then I also think looking at some of the most popular models is also really interesting, because if these are going to tend to have, pretty good documentation and also a lot of use cases of them. So looking at the models that people are using and where and how can generate a lot of ideas, and you can also generate a lot of kind of recipes. You can make a little bit of a cookbook for yourself out of what are other people doing. So I want to play with some code here. Now, I like to say when I am live coding stuff, and in this case, I'm not even really coding, I'm just going to run stuff. It's up to you if you want to do this along with me. Some people like to learn by pressing the button and seeing the outputs come out for themselves. Other people, I think, it helps to just look at what I'm doing, think about what you think is going to happen, try to anticipate it, and then see if you get it right. So there's no pressure to do this along with me. This is also, even though this is in Python, if you're not used to doing Python, I think that's actually okay, because this is much more about just recipes for how people do things, and then it's fairly remixable, and this is also pretty high level, as in the code is, I think it's pretty readable. It's pretty, I don't want to say it's easy, because if you're not used to coding, it's not easy, right? But as far as code goes, if you've coded at all, I think this is on the end of the spectrum where if I'm explaining what it does and you're looking at it, I think you'll be able to follow. So this is a tutorial that I am lovingly stealing from Louis Tunstall from Hugging Face, which is, he also is one of the authors. There's an O'Reilly book called Natural Language Processing with Transformers. Anytime you see a model that has T in the acronym, like GPT, the T is usually these days stands for transformers. So if you want to go deep into why do these models work and how, I would recommend reading that book. There's also a lot of YouTube videos of people doing tutorials about transformers. So there's a lot of materials out there. But Lewis is one of the authors of the Python library that we're going to use here. So this is basically, they're talking about some examples of transformers. The main thing to know is, in addition to transformers being a core part of the architecture that is really revolutionizing a lot of deep learning models recently, transformers is also a library for Python that allows us to interface with Model Hub models. And it gives us some fairly nice abstractions for doing things with minimal code. So I'm going to run this cell here. This is a Jupyter notebook for anyone that's not familiar. This helps us combine code, text, and look at the output of code pretty quickly. So we're just installing this, making sure that this is available. If you don't run this, then this Google Colab worksheet that I'm in won't know what transformers is. It won't have it queued up for the workspace. So basically, transformers has these abstractions called pipelines. So pipelines basically do a lot of work in very little code for us. And I think the simplest way to see that is just to get into it. They do have some YouTube videos that they suggest that they've developed. Unfortunately, they're not rendering in Google Colab, so you would have to click through to YouTube. I'm not going to sit here and make us watch YouTube videos together, but if you want to go deeper, I would recommend watching some of their materials here. So let's start with one of the most common tasks in NLP, which is text classification. We need a snippet of text for the model to do the analysis on. So what they've done is they've created here a fictitious piece of customer feedback about a certain online order. So this text is someone who is complaining that they've ordered an Optimus Prime action figure, and unfortunately they've received a Megatron, and this is very sad for them. And this little piece of code here does absolutely nothing but make a prettier printout of the text. So they want to do a task called sentiment classification. If you look on the Model Hub, you are going to see a lot of models for sentiment classification. It's very common in e-commerce. Basically, is this feedback positive or negative? I will say, in science, when I supervise a lot of student projects, I don't actually think sentiment is what we want. Most of the time, I think it's actually something else. Like when I was talking about the problem with the vaccine stance, that's a stance detection problem. It's not actually sentiment. A sentence, for example, could be pro-vaccine and negative sentiment. For example, I'm totally unable to find a place that will give me a vaccine. This is so frustrating. That is a negative sentiment, but that is a pro-vaccine stance. So sentiment detection is not, it's very common in e-commerce, so you're going to see it a lot in models specialized for it. I don't know how often it is that you actually want this, but it's still useful to kind of teach this workflow. So if we want to predict, and if we're e-commerce, we really do, we want to know if this is positive or negative. We can use a model for this kind of task, and there's a lot of models that are specialized because this is a task that millions of people who work on e-commerce care about. So they have a diagram here kind of what is happening when you're going into a sentiment detection model. And again, even if this doesn't make perfect sense to you, that's okay, because if this is not, the purpose of this class is just to get us started. Understanding the models is really complex. But essentially what happens is you put in some sequence into a model. So there's their sentence here, and they've split it up by words. Then things get tokenized, right? So it gets broken down into these chunks, and these would be what we saw in the vocabulary file. So those are chunks that are part of the model's vocabulary. Then those get turned into a numerical representation in the model, right? So all models they only represent really, computers only really do numbers. A word to or a token to a computer is essentially a number, it's a matrix representation that contains some numbers. And then we go through several layers of the model, and essentially what we end up with right when we're about to exit the model, at the very end of the model, is a final representation of it, which is usually a vector of some sort. And then on that, you're going to map that vector into, now we decide, is that positive or negative, right? So that's the last layer of the model, this dense layer. And if that didn't make a lot of sense, that is okay. Yes.
Is it when a token is missing that the model tends to hallucinate?
Say that again?
Is it when a token is missing in the model, that's when it tends to hallucinate?
Is it when a token is missing in the model, is that when it tends to hallucinate? Not exactly. Hallucinations can happen for a lot of reasons. You could have, you could be prompting on something and every single word or in your prompt is in the vocabulary and it can still hallucinate. So hallucinations are another rich topic, but it has a lot to do probably with models not being grounded in anything. They're just sort of, it's matrix algebra on, you know, matrices that represent text, and it's very powerful, but it's also not necessarily matched to, you know, a physical world. And so hallucinations can happen for a lot of reasons. Yes, a good question. So to load the transformer model for this, in Python, you use this phrasing from the transformers library, import this thing called pipeline. And what we do here is then create something called sentiment pipeline. So that's just the variable name. That could be whatever we want. We could call it Kevin. It doesn't matter, but we're calling it sentiment pipeline because that's a reasonable name. And then we're making this thing pipeline, and we're passing this argument text classification. So that's an argument. It has these options. And so text classification is something that the pipeline construction basically has already set up. So we're saying, hey, use the presets you have for a text classification pipeline. And this is gonna take a while. Why did this take a while? We could see that some stuff is downloading. No model was supplied, defaulted to Distilbert, distill-based, uncased, fine-tuned SS2 English, and revision, and then this little code. So essentially what this is it's saying, you didn't tell me which model to use in the pipeline, so I defaulted. I picked for you a model that's for text classification, and you can actually follow it. You can just click that link and you can see what it is. And so then you would be able to trace exactly, this model is a fine-tuned checkpoint of a previous model. This is how it's evaluated, and this is for a sentiment detection task, essentially. Yeah. Okay. So it also downloaded the model. So it put it in kind of a secret location. Like you can figure out where it is. You can look up in the documentation where the model is downloaded to. But essentially, the model is now on the computer. It's not on my laptop. It's on a Colab is basically Google's computer. Google is letting me use their computer through my browser. So it's on Google's computer, but you could find it in the file system if you wanted to. So now it's downloaded essentially the materials that it takes to, the model weights, the vocab, the config file, which is going to include information for the computer basically about how this model, how do you kind of put it together. Okay. Now we are going to be able to run some text through. So remember, and I'm just going to, let me make it code one. Let's just see, what is text? So just a reminder, text is this string here. And now we just say sentiment pipeline, which we instantiated above. We put in the text, and it's going to come out with this thing here. So it puts out this kind of structured object here. So we have label, negative, right? So that's seems like what we might expect because if this was a negative sentiment, and a score. So score. Sometimes these things look to people like they're probabilities. For some models, score is a probability, but it's often not exactly the same as a probability. So just make sure that you look up on the model card and where it's trained what is score, because it may not be a probability. In this case, I think it's not the same as a probability, just so you know. Okay, and we can actually pull things out of this, right? So we could use, we could say, it's kind of like we're indexing. It looks like this is a list, and inside that list is this little dictionary, this key value pair. So we could say, pull out the first element of this list here, and then I can say, and now just give me the label, perhaps. Let's see what it does for this. I think it is bad. I think it is fine. Let's see. I just want to play with it and see what happens. So now it changed to positive and the score is very high. To me, that's kind of funny because I don't think it is fine is overwhelmingly positive, but that's okay. Yeah, it's kind of fun to play with it and just sort of see as you perturb things, how does the model behave, right? So looking at not just the category label, but also things like the score, because the score is a kind of proxy for how certain is the model. And sometimes these things can be weirdly sensitive. On some models, if we put in a white space, it'll change just slightly, although this one didn't, so that's good. But some models are very sensitive to things that are very subtle. Okay, so that was kind of an example, and in fact, you could feed in a list too. You don't have to just feed in one thing at a time, right? And that's really what you'd want to do. If you have, dozens and dozens of text that you wanted to do some kind of task on, you're going to programmatically, you're going to try to pass the bunch in at once. You're not going to write your code, do it on this, do it on this, do it on this. You're not going to write it, hundreds of times. Another example is this task called named entity recognition. So essentially what this is that you're trying to figure out if you have some text, what's an entity? And an entity is things like a person, a place. So here we go, we can have Crystal Lands, right? So that is a person. San Diego is a location. So this is a kind of way to featureize text. We're extracting a couple features about the text out. So they have a pipeline for this. You can just use this argument NER. And you wouldn't know these things. Like you wouldn't know that you write text classification or NER off the top of your head. You would read the documentation about this library, and then you would learn what are some of the tasks that it can do. So it downloads a different model. Again, we didn't specify the model in this call, so we default to a library here that they're showing us. Yep, that looks good. Looks fine. There's some warning here. I'm going to ignore it right now. In practice, you should probably not ignore warnings. You should understand what things do, but I'm going to ignore it. And then we can print out this. Let's try running it. Entities with our text, and let's see what happens. Entity group org for Word Amazon. Oh, and it tells you what character index that starts on and where it ends. If determined that Optimus Prime is some kind of entity, but it's not sure which. Let's see, I'm just gonna loop through this. Yeah, so Optimus Prime is a miscellaneous entity. Germany is a location. And they have a nice way. They just suggest some code for cleaning this up, for printing this out in a neat format. And it looks like we have each one's score with it. So generally, lower score is less confident. And then they point out that in the original text we gave it, the model didn't know what that Megatron or Decepticons, or it looks like it actually split them into two. It split Decepticons. And that might be because that's how it's tokenized. I think that's what happened. I think it's that it tokenized it this way. And so Decepticons were split into two different entities here. That's my guess. But they say this is probably no surprise since the original data set for this model didn't contain a lot of transformers. So if you knew that you were going to have an influx of reviews about your transformer action figures, you might want to fine-tune a model so that it's actually going to contain that text or some examples that are relevant. Okay, let's see. I'm thinking if I want to go through all of these. Let's do two more. Okay. Another example is question answering. In this task, the model gets a question and a context and needs to find the answer within that context. This is actually not the same as generating an answer from scratch. It's saying, can we find the answer within a text? So don't generate, use the text I've given you and see if the answer is in that text, and if so, tell me where. I actually like this quite a lot. So I recently saw this in is there's Allen Institute AI 2 in Seattle, which is a nonprofit research group that does all sorts of AI research. They have a search engine for research called ASTA. And so if you're looking for papers that are on a topic, it will do a search, but it will also pull out for you, and I think it uses a model like this, where in the text of the paper they've found, the topic that you're looking for. So it gives like supporting evidence for why it picked that paper. And I like that a lot better than getting a generated answer of like, here's why this paper is relevant, because if something is generated, I have to go back and check it anyway. Like, I'd rather they not waste the inference on that, because and it doesn't save me any time. I trust it more if I can just straight up see the quote from the paper. So for this here, oh, you know what? Yes, everything here, when I said on the last one, I just want to point out that this gave you these values for where things start and end. Start and end are probably tokens. They are probably not characters. My apologies. So right here, what we're doing is we're going to give some text. So let's load in the question answering pipeline. It again defaults to picking a model. It's going to download the model. And all of this has caching, so if I am to run this again, it will usually be quicker because it's already downloaded the model and it remembers that it's already downloaded it. So the question is, what does the customer want? And then it pulls out, I think it did a pretty good job, an exchange of Megatron, and it gives the token indices for where that actually happened. And that's from the text that we originally gave it. Text summarization is another application of BERT models, and everything that we've shown so far is a variant. It's something that is a BERT model has been adapted for that particular task. So what we have here is, let's just try it. Summarization pipeline, we'll pull it up again. It again defaults to a preferred model that they recommend. This model was trained on, and you can see it here, CNN. This is a rare case where CNN doesn't stand for convolutional neural network. It stands for CNN, the news network. But you can read it. This is a little bit out of domain for e-commerce. This is a data set, I think, of CNN and Daily Mail articles with summarizations, but I do think that performance is actually not bad. So we're giving it the text that we want summarized, an argument about the max length, and then just print it out. Bumblebee ordered an Optimus Prime action figure from your online store in Germany. Unfortunately, when I opened the package, I discovered to my horror that I had been sent an action figure of Megatron instead. It's not a perfect summarization because if they think that Bumblebee is the one who ordered it, and that is not correct. I do think it's hard to imagine a lot of more recent models, because this model's a couple years old and it's not the biggest model. I don't think that the largest, most recent models would make this mistake, but just an example. There's also translation. There are plenty of these. Oh, I really like zero-shot classification. Zero-shot is essentially, let's see, I'm going to give it, I'm nervous to get the vaccine. Let's try that. And let's give it these classifications. Pro-vaccine, hesitant, anti-vaccine, irrelevant. Okay. They gave this example in German, so I'm just switching it. So we're going to load in a zero-shot classifier. Zero-shot classification is something a lot of large language models are very good at. It's essentially where you give it a text and then you just give it a list of candidate labels. And you haven't given it any rubric, you haven't told it any information, you're just saying which of these labels is this closest to. But it looks like it's also a fairly large model that is being downloaded. And as they point out here, this is a pretty good baseline because of if your zero-shot classification is as good as doing a fine-tuned model for that classification, that means your fine-tune is not very impressive. So it does help you create a bit of a baseline. So I do like that idea. Gave me a syntax warning. Yeah, so I'm nervous to get the vaccine. These are the labels, and then for each label it gives a score. Again, scores are not probabilities. If these were probabilities, the probability over all the classes, we want that to sum to 1. These numbers do not sum to 1, right? So the score is highest for hesitant. So that's not too bad. If I were trying, the classification of tweets today, I might try something like this because of models have only gotten better at doing few shot, but I would still probably then compare it to a fine-tuned model to see which was superior. All right. They also have, and this is printing out, you can see all this in the documentation too, but there's a lot of tasks that are supported for these kind of out-of-the-box applications. So audio classification, automatic speech recognition. So essentially these do a lot of the work for you of setting up, download a model, put in your data, run inference, report it. It handles that very nicely for you. You don't have to use this library. You can download a model to your computer and do all this. Like you could hand code all this stuff as well. This is just a nice place to get started. Okay. So I just want to point to a couple things in there in the Hugging Face hub. They have some self-guided courses. A lot of these are pretty good. So the LLM course in particular, if you really want to work on large language models and understand how they work, I would recommend taking this. It is, fairly challenging, but I think it's worth it for a lot of folks who particularly want to do scientific research involving LLMs. They have a cookbook. The cookbook basically is all sorts of code examples that people have contributed. A lot of programming is you find something someone else has made and then you remix it. So often like 80% of getting the way towards making something that works for you is finding somebody who made something similar and then figure out what you can lovingly steal from them, right? The essence of this world is we credit everybody, we point back to who inspired us, but people put this stuff out here because they want it to be reused and learned from. So there's just lots and lots of these examples here. So computer vision, code search. And again, it can be a little bit, I think the hardest thing for scientists is that a lot of use cases that people have in the world are not scientific use cases. So picking through what's relevant is really the hardest part. But I still recommend looking through the cookbook a bit. Okay, I want to talk briefly about evaluation. So how do you know if anything works? That's really kind of the hard part here. When we are prototyping, and as we've just done, right, as I was showing you going through that notebook, we do a lot of, at least I just did a lot of, well, that looks good to me. That looks like a pretty good summarization. That looks like a pretty good classification. But that's not really scientific, right? Like if I were to go publish something and say like, yeah, well, I classified all these tweets and it looked pretty good, right? That's not really rigorous. So we have to think about how do we know that any approach we're doing, how are we reasonably convinced it works? And if we're trying to argue that we're making a methodological advance by using an AI model in some way, we want to show that it was at least as good as what we had before. And this is a real risk, right? Is that we could sometimes say, oh, well, I used an LLM, so it's very cool, but maybe it's not better than whatever workflow you had before. Maybe it's actually worse. That can happen. So we often want to find ways to make things measurable and then go out and measure them. So evaluation is where your expertise is critical. I thought about, should I show you like a library for doing evaluations? And I actually don't think that, yeah, there's eval libraries out there. A lot of models will have like a type of evaluation that is sort of specific for the task they're doing. But I actually think this is the part that you should spend the most time thinking about yourself and kind of make it from scratch. So if you were doing an image classification task, right? So maybe you have pictures of cells and you're trying to classify, is a certain cell type present? Yeah, you will want to use if the model, if the people who make the model often report its accuracy, of course you'd want to report its accuracy, but what you might care about as a scientist is what types of confusions does it make? Do you have a really big class imbalance because of maybe something is comparatively rare? When errors happen, are they a certain kind of error? You have to think through that as a domain expert. And so I actually don't think you should rely too heavily on, out of the box kind of metrics. There's not an easy answer there. There's not a one-size-fits-all answer. So yeah, you can use things like accuracy when there are, that sort of thing, but it's not a substitute for taking the time to make sure that's a reasonable measure to present. There's also benchmarks, so most large language models, like the BERT models, there are going to be benchmarks that they're trained on, but those are things that have to generally do with text fluency, does it do a good job representing qualities of the text it was trying to model? And that actually is pretty orthogonal a lot of the times to, is it scientifically useful in the setting you put it in? So you're going to have to think about that for yourself and come up with an argument for how do you know that you've made a scientific advance, and that is going to be pretty specific to the field you work in, the problem you're solving. So I don't want to say anything overly prescriptive here, other than most of the time knowing that your model meets the standard, natural language processing metrics for text fluency or something is just not the same as being scientifically meaningful. Make sure you have a baseline for comparison. If you are, and I like to say, figure out the simplest model that you could possibly imagine knowing nothing about your data set. This is super trivial, but if somebody wants to tell me that they're doing a good job forecasting, okay, tell me if you can just beat, I always predict yesterday's measurement or something, the last measurement I have. I just assume perfect autocorrelation with what just happened. Or if you want to say, yeah, I classified something, well, do you do better than always picking the majority class, right? Think about, if you knew nothing about this problem, what's the simplest, most naive, performance you could achieve with very little information? And then are you really sure that you're doing better than that? Make sure you don't fool yourself, because it's not always given that using a model, is going to improve on what you do. Or how much better is it than linear regression, right? Sometimes that's really what really is fine. I also think that some situations the evaluation is a little tricky. Sometimes people are saying we're putting in a model in, we're running a study where we want to find out if people talking to a chatbot, do they have the same outcome measures as some other treatment? When that happens, how do you evaluate, right, the chatbot? I would say that in addition to things like showing, what measures would we take for any kind of clinical intervention, right? Treat it the same as any other intervention that you're trying to study. But I would also go deeper into looking at logs, right? What are people actually doing with this? Really, there's no substitute for just reading and looking really closely at what's happening. That brings me to my next point. Look at it. Really look at it. Look at hundreds of inputs and outputs. Try playing with, perturb it. See if I just perturb a little bit, if I'm putting in image data, if I, if the pictures are taken slightly differently, how much does that affect? Are my results really sensitive to things like that? Really just try to break it, honestly. And so make sure that you get kind of familiar with what are the actual kinds of errors that happen. And I would say, really don't start trying to summarize your evals with any statistic or a metric until you've really looked yourself. Don't code too early. Just look. Also, be careful with data leakage and contamination. Data leakage is when, if you are trying to fine-tune something, don't fine-tune on all your data and then report on that, right? You've got to leave a little bit of data out that the model has never, ever seen. You got to be absolutely sure it's really uncontaminated. That's still tricky for people, right? That's data science 101, and we still catch issues with this in scientific practice just because it's hard to fully prevent. So definitely really think about that. Contamination also is when it's more common with like large language models that are trained on the whole of the internet. If the thing you're trying to test the model on is conceivably on the internet, the model might have already been trained on it. So this is like when people say, oh, the model it answers all the LSAT questions perfectly. Are the LSAT questions on the internet? If they're on the internet, you can bet that OpenAI trained on it, right? So this may or may not be relevant for a scientific application, but just think about if it applies. And finally, don't fine tune until you figured out your evals. You don't have to get crazy complicated, but if you have no way of knowing if one model performs better than the other, then don't start trying to tweak all the models, right? Think about how would you know if this is any better than my baseline? And until you can answer that question, don't go crazy trying to, you don't have to be too fancy. Okay, a couple more tips to learn from other people. Try to replicate their work. So find like papers that you see in your area that are using a model in an interesting way. Try to find the code attached to it. Can you run it? Can you figure out where the model comes from? How are they using it scientifically? And how did they evaluate it? Just like learn from what other people are doing. And also try to keep an eye on, well, what's the methodological contribution here? Because I think a lot of things that don't make a methodological contribution scientifically are maybe kind of ephemeral, right? We really care about, does this improve our ability to do science in some way? So keep an eye on that angle. It's also possible, and I think this is one reason why sometimes people don't get into experimenting with tools, is that there's not a guarantee that putting a model in will be better. Or you might have a model, but it doesn't have like certain properties that you really need for what you do, right? You might need something where you can get like really clear confidence intervals on their performance in order to do, statistical inference. A lot of these classes of models, that is not a given. There's not a straightforward way to do that, or it might not be interpretable in the way that you need. So it's possible that a model will not fit for the need you have. So not every problem actually needs one of the models that I've shown you, and only you can determine that with your expertise. And finally, just email people about if they made something and they put it on the internet, they open sourced it, and they are sharing it with the world. Just like email them about it if you have questions. Seriously, people will email you back. It's kind of shocking and amazing that people will help you with stuff, or if you're trying to repurpose what they've done or you like it a lot, just reach out to them. It's fairly cool, and most of the best things that have happened to me in science have been because of other people being willing to help and surprising me with their generosity. So that's my last note. The final thing is that we have a survey recommended by Midas for you to take, and I'll open up for questions on anything we've covered. Yes.
This is awesome, thank you. A lot of it is open source, just clearly they pay for models, and there's a pricing button on top, and so when does it get to that point? How's it structured?
Yes, okay, so the question is, when does this bleed over to having to pay for stuff? So my understanding from Hugging Face is if you downloading models on the hub is completely free. There are inference providers, and inference providers are people who are hosting the models. So that means they have it on their computer and they run it for you. That would be like if you were serving a model at scale on the internet, you want that. If you are doing a model for a scientific application, the model lives on your computer and you are the only one who's doing the inference, there's no reason to be paying for this.
No accounting needed or anything. The login button is only if you want to do this other stuff, right?
Yeah, I have had once or twice, like my IP, they're like, please log in. We've noticed you're on here a lot. I think there may be some things that require you to have an account to get access to certain models, maybe that they host on their API, but if you're not doing that, you can just download models. Yeah. Questions? Yes? Yeah, okay, are models deterministic or not? So deterministic models means that if you always give them the same input, they will always give you the same output. It's a little, weirdly complicated question. In theory, any model, just being a bunch of matrix algebra operations, can be set to be deterministic. In practice, when models are hosted, they often are not. If you download a model and you can fix things like seeds in your environment, usually you can. But if you've ever worked with like TensorFlow, you will find that there are sometimes weird things where it is weirdly hard to set the seed, or you will have to set like 3 different seeds. So basically, there will almost always be a way to fix the model, but there may be some engineering required. Yeah. Yes.
So, for anyone interested in social media kinds of text, with the ramp AI to interpret what AI also said?
Yeah, this is a good question. It's basically a picture of social media studies. If a lot of AI text is being used to generate the social media content, I don't know. As I said, I can't even work on that project. I actually just gave up doing computational social science because after Twitter shut down all their API, is like, okay, I don't know where I could conceivably conduct this research anymore. I think that's a real question that a lot of people are facing, is that there's pollution of the data sources. So I don't know how people are handling that. And I think that's a real question. It's also a real question for people that do like prolific kind of or mechanical Turk type data collection, where if you have people on the internet are contributing data anonymously to your project, and then you don't know how many of them are bots or are putting it in through an LLM, I think we don't know. On Twitter, historically at least, there was always pretty good bot detection. Like, yeah, there were bots, but they weren't that hard to spot. I imagine that problem's gotten harder, but I don't know for sure. Yeah. So unfortunately, I don't know the answer other than to say, yeah, that's concerning. Yeah. Yes.
So I know that in the Jupyter notebook, we've been using a lot of default models. So how are the default models chosen?
Yeah, how are the default models chosen? So basically, in writing the library, they pick it for you, basically. So they pick basically what's like a very common, generally applicable model. I would say if you're using something scientifically, it's okay to use the default, but you should have clearly thought through like why. Why is that a good one? I think in the library, in the documentation for this library, they're going to give examples. So if we just go to docs for transformers, yeah, they've got the pipeline. So yeah, they have all the docs here, and you could see for any given function, what are the parameters, and how would you pass, for example, in your own custom model for it. Yes? Yes, exactly, yes. And that's a good point here. So in Python will often infer based on the order of the arguments. What is that? So it inferred, we didn't have to write task equals, but you can also write task equals, and that's probably a pretty good practice. Yes? Yeah, that's a good question. So if you change the model, will anything else change other than the model that's being passed in? I think it's, the question I'm coming up with is the tokenizer, because I'm not actually sure if the tokenizer is fixed to the model or if the tokenizer can change. That's a good question, and I'm going to say consult the docs on that. I could give you an answer, but I wouldn't be completely confident. Anything else? All right, how about everybody have a safe trip home, okay? Thank you for coming.